My name is Olivia Hale, and the last time my father looked me in the eye, he told me I was dead to him. That was 20 years ago. Today at my mother's funeral, I stood in full navy dress blues while he walked up to me with that same old smug smile like I was still 16, still scared, still the daughter he thought he could shame into disappearing. He leaned in and whispered, "So, you finally learned your lesson." And in that moment, after 2 decades of silence, after building a life he never believed I could, I looked him squarely in the face and said, calm as a quiet tide, "Yeah, then meet my husband." But before I could explain who I became, I need to tell you who I was. 20 years earlier, I was a scrawny 10th grader in a small Midwestern town, the kind of place where people still judged you by the church you went to, the shape of your lawn, and whether your family name held up at the Friday football games. My father cared about all of those things too much. He wasn't a bad man exactly, just a proud one, a rigid one. A man who thought reputation was something fragile like glass, and it was his job to protect it from scratches. My mother was softer, quieter, the kind of woman who always kept her hands folded and her sentences short to keep the peace. I was neither of them. I was stubborn, curious, and naive enough to believe first love meant forever. His name was Matthew. He was a year older, worked part-time at the hardware store, and had those soft, scruffy cheeks that made him look older than 17. He made me laugh. He made me feel seen. And in all the wrong ways, he made me feel grown up. I still remember the day the pregnancy test turned positive. I stared at those 2 pink lines in the cramped stall of the high school bathroom, the sound of girls gossiping and zipping makeup bags echoing off the tiles. I didn't cry. Not at first. I just felt still. Like the world had gone quiet around me and only I could hear the ticking of my own heartbeat. When I told Matthew, he froze, not the way my father would later, but like a boy suddenly realizing the game he'd been playing had real rules and consequences. He promised he'd figure something out, but by the next week his mother had transferred him to another school, and he stopped answering my calls. I learned then how fast a future can evaporate. Telling my parents was harder. I rehearsed it for days, whispering into my pillow at night, imagining my father's face falling, my mother collapsing into tears. But reality was worse, much worse. It was a Thursday evening. The kitchen smelled like pot roast and onions, and the news hummed low in the background. I waited until dinner was over, until Dad folded his napkin the way he always did, twice, lengthwise, once crosswise, before clearing his throat and asking if I had homework. "Dad," I said, my voice cracking, "I need to talk to you and Mom." He looked annoyed before he even knew why. That was just how he was. But when the words came out, "I'm pregnant," the world seemed to split. My mother gasped and covered her mouth. My father went still, the redness rising in his neck like a thermometer hitting a boil. "You what?" he said, his voice low, dangerous. I tried to speak, but he cut me off. "No daughter of mine is going to bring shame into this house. You want to act like an adult? Fine, go be one." My mother whispered, "Robert, please, she's scared." But he shoved his chair back so hard it scraped the floor. "Get out," he said. "If you walk out that door tonight, you don't come back." I packed my backpack with shaking hands, just clothes, my school books, a framed picture of my mom and me at the county fair. As I walked toward the front door, I felt my mother's hand brush mine for half a second, soft trembling, but she didn't pull me back. Couldn't. She was trapped between the man she married and the daughter she wanted to protect. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting. I walked to the bus station, sat on a hard plastic bench under buzzing fluorescent lights, pulled my jacket around me and pressed my palm against the small swell of my stomach. It wasn't really showing yet, but I needed the contact, something to tether me, something to remind me I wasn't truly alone. That night, I learned what loneliness tasted like, and fear, and anger, and something else, something small but powerful, resolve. Because while my father believed kicking me out would break me, something inside me whispered that I had to survive. Not just for me, for the little heartbeat growing inside me. I spent the next few days bouncing between couches and spare rooms, trying not to outstay my welcome. A high school counselor slipped me a list of shelters and support centers. A kind woman at church gave me 2 bags of groceries. And yet shame clung to me everywhere I went. I heard whispers. I saw judgment in eyes that used to greet me with warmth. But I also learned something my father never understood: kindness can grow in the cracks where pride collapses, and strangers can sometimes give more love than blood. The first weeks of pregnancy were a blur of nausea, exhaustion, and fear of what came next. But somewhere in the middle of all that, a seed of strength began to grow slow, stubborn, and steady. A strength I didn't know I would need for the next 20 years. And a strength my father would come face to face with at my mother's funeral. The weeks after I left home felt like moving through thick, freezing fog, every step heavy, every breath uncertain. I had no plan, no money beyond what I saved from babysitting, and no one I felt I could burden for too long. People were kind in small, fleeting ways: a pastor who offered a warm meal, a classmate's mother who let me stay on their couch for 2 nights, a grocery store clerk who quietly slipped an extra box of crackers into my bag. But nothing was stable, and nothing was mine. By the end of the second week, exhaustion hit me like a freight train. I was nauseous most mornings and terrified every night. Walking through town, I kept imagining my father's truck slowing beside me, his voice ordering me back home with that mixture of anger and authority I had grown up under. But he never came. Not once. He had meant every word when he said I was dead to him. The turning point came one cold Saturday morning. I was sitting on the curb outside the library, hugging my backpack, my makeshift suitcase, while my breath curled like smoke in the air. I hadn't eaten since the day before, too embarrassed to ask the church pantry for more food. That's when a small, older woman stepped out of the library door. She wore a powder blue cardigan and held a stack of returned books against her chest. She looked at me for a long second, not with judgment but with recognition. "Honey," she said softly, "you look like you need a warm place to sit." Her name was Mrs. Callahan, though she asked me to call her Irene. She'd been a widow for years, lived alone in a little house with mint green shutters, and volunteered at the library to have a reason to get out of the house, as she put it. She didn't know my story when she first invited me in for tea. She just knew what loneliness looked like. Inside her home, everything smelled faintly of cinnamon and lemon cleaner. She poured tea, cut a slice of banana bread, and waited, not prying, not guessing, until I spoke. And when I finally did, explaining the pregnancy, my father's reaction, and the nights I'd spent bouncing from place to place, she didn't gasp or scold or look disappointed. She simply reached out, patted my hand, and said, "No child should go through that alone." That afternoon she offered me her basement room. It wasn't much, a small space with a twin bed and a narrow window, but it was warm, safe, and mine. I cried that night silently, partly from relief, and partly from the sting of realizing how quickly my own family had thrown me aside compared to how gently a stranger held space for me. Living with Irene didn't solve everything, but it gave me stability. She taught me how to budget the little money I earned at a diner job she helped me find. She drove me to prenatal appointments when the nausea became overwhelming. She taught me how to make a grocery list, how to stretch $1, and how to stand tall when people whispered behind my back at the store. "You don't owe them a single explanation," she'd say. "Shame only grows when you feed it." Slowly, I finished my GED coursework at night. The Adult Education Center was in a converted office building beside the highway, smelling of old carpet and dry erase markers. Most students were older, laid-off workers, single parents, folks trying to start over. I fit right in. In their eyes, I wasn't the pregnant teenager who had embarrassed her family. I was just another person trying to build a future. One evening after class, a man in uniform stood near the front desk, chatting with a few students. He wore navy blues, his posture crisp, his smile easy. The patch on his arm caught my eye before anything else, an anchor. Something about that symbol, steady grounded, pulled me closer. He was a Navy recruiter doing an outreach visit. When I passed nearby, he nodded politely. "Evening. You thinking about next steps after your GED?" I hesitated. "Not really. Just trying to get through this week." He smiled gently, as if he heard the truth in my voice. "If you ever want to talk options, the Navy has programs for young parents. It's not easy, but it's steady work. Structure, healthcare, housing." The words settled in me like stones, sinking into still water. Structure, healthcare, housing, all the things I desperately needed. But I brushed it off at first. I couldn't imagine myself in uniform. I barely believed I could make it through the month. Then came the night when worry nearly swallowed me whole. I woke up with sharp cramps, nothing dangerous, the doctor said the next day, just stress. But in those dark hours I realized just how fragile my situation was. I needed more than kindness and temporary solutions. I needed a future. I started researching quietly, reading pamphlets, watching videos, talking to the recruiter again, this time with real questions. He didn't sugarcoat anything. Boot camp would be brutal. I'd have to leave my baby for the duration 8 weeks that would feel like a lifetime. My child would need a guardian during that time. When I told Irene, she didn't hesitate. If this is what you want, I'll take care of the baby. I raised 3 boys. 1 more won't scare me. I cried then, not out of fear, but out of love so unexpected it broke me open. The day my baby was born, I held that tiny warm bundle against my chest and whispered a promise. You will never know the kind of abandonment I did. I will build us a life no one can take away. Motherhood at 16 was overwhelming. Nights blurred together. Diapers, bottles, exhaustion so deep I felt hollow. But every time I looked at my child, those soft eyes, those tiny fingers curling around mine, I felt a fire inside me growing stronger. 3 months later, I shipped out for basic training. Standing at the airport watching Irene hold my baby close while I stepped toward the gate nearly shattered me, but I kept walking. Because sometimes walking away from your past is the only way to walk toward your future. I didn't know it then, but that decision would shape the next 20 years of my life and lead me right back to the church steps where my father would freeze at the sight of the woman he never imagined I could become. Boot camp stripped me down to nothing and rebuilt me from the bones outward. The first morning before the sun even thought about rising, a whistle shrieked through the barracks and boots thundered across the floor. I shot upright, heart-pounding, thinking for a split second that I was back in my father's house and he was yelling again. But this time it wasn't anger. It was command structure purpose. On your feet. Move, move, move. Those first weeks were a blur of sweat-aching muscles and swallowing fear just to make room for determination. I was younger than most recruits, but carried more weight inside than any of them could see. When we were ordered to run miles in the cold dawn, I thought of my child sleeping safe in Irene's arms. When we crawled under barbed wire on our bellies, I thought of the night I'd been thrown out of my home. When a petty officer told me I didn't have what it took, I heard my father's words echoing dead to me and I shoved myself farther faster. I wasn't the strongest, I wasn't the fastest, but I was the one who refused to quit. I found my footing slowly, made a few friends, learned how to take orders and how to breathe through the moments when my chest tightened with missing my baby. Letters from Irene were my lifeline. She wrote about the baby's first giggle the first time tiny fingers wrapped around hers, the way the child looked toward the door as if expecting me to walk in. I cried quietly into my pillow, after lights out muffling the sounds so no one would hear. But every tear sharpened my resolve. By the time I graduated basic, I stood straighter. My uniform fit not just my body, but some part of my spirit I hadn't known was waiting for it. When they pinned my insignia on, I imagined my mother clapping softly, and my father standing in the back pretending not to be proud. But reality was different. The only person waiting at home was Irene rocking my baby on her porch swing. And somehow that was enough. The Navy sent me to specialized training next logistics. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the backbone of operations: what goes where, who gets what, how supplies move to keep everything functioning. It appealed to the part of me that craved order after a childhood of emotional chaos. Schedules, checklists, procedures. Training was demanding, but I discovered something surprising. I was good at it. Good at problem solving, good at staying calm when others panicked, good at seeing connection points others missed. My instructors noticed. For the first time in my life, authority figures didn't look at me with disappointment. They looked at me with belief. Every time I earned a certificate or passed an evaluation, I tucked the paperwork into a folder I kept in my wall locker. On the front, I taped the Christmas card my mother had secretly sent me months earlier, a quiet reminder that somewhere beneath all the silence and shame she still cared. When I finished my schooling, I received orders for my first duty station. Stepping off the transport plane, seeing rows of sailors moving with practiced efficiency, hearing the hum of engines and cranes, smelling the mix of salt diesel and hot pavement, I felt for the first time that I belonged somewhere. I sent money home as soon as I could, insisting Irene spend some on herself, even though she protested. She was the only family I had left, and she was raising my child with more love than I'd ever known in my own home. Life settled into a rhythm. Work, sleep, calls home when time zones lined up. I missed birthdays, first steps, and first words, each absence carving a quiet ache into my heart. But every reunion filled that ache with something stronger: gratitude. My child ran to me with open arms every time I came home on leave, babbling stories and clinging to my uniform with sticky little hands. Their laugh became my favorite sound. Years passed. I learned to lead small teams, then larger ones. I gained the trust of officers who'd once doubted a young mother could handle the stress. I got promoted, then promoted again. The girl who'd slept on buses and couches now managed operations worth millions of dollars. My father's prediction that I'd ruin my life faded like fog burned off by morning sun. Still, there were nights I lay awake staring at the barracks ceiling or the small apartment I later rented, wondering about my parents, wondering if my mother thought of me, wondering if my father ever softened. But the past was a room I kept shut, too dusty and painful to revisit. One memory lingered above the rest: the day I returned home on leave when my child was 4. I wore my uniform, crisp pressed ribbons neatly aligned. Irene had dressed my child in a little outfit and brushed their hair with such care. We decided to walk into town for ice cream. People stared, but not with judgment this time, with curiosity, even respect. An older veteran approached me outside the ice cream shop, saluted with trembling fingers, and said, "Proud of you, young lady." I felt a lump in my throat. That was the kind of fatherly pride I had craved my whole life. But that moment made something else clear. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of my father's rejection. I had built something real, something strong. And even if he never saw it, I did. My child did. Irene did. The next decade moved in steady chapters: deployments, homecomings, holidays spent with friends who became family. I watched my child grow taller, braver, wiser. We moved to a small house off base, painted the kitchen a soft yellow, because it reminded me of mornings with Irene. And then one day, love arrived quietly. Not dramatic, not whirlwind, just steady and genuine. He wasn't Navy, though he respected my service. He had warm eyes, steady hands, and a calm that anchored me. He loved my child as naturally as breathing, and he loved me with a patience I didn't know how to receive at first. Slowly, I let him in. He became my husband, my partner, and the proof that my past didn't define me. I had survived the impossible. I had built a life I once thought was out of reach. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have predicted, was that this life, this strength, this love, would one day stand face to face with the man who threw me out. And in that confrontation, everything would shift. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind where nothing seems poised to change your life. I had just finished a long shift, still in uniform boots, dusty from walking the length of the pier twice. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, an area code from my hometown. I almost let it go to voicemail. For 20 years, calls from that place had brought nothing but old ghosts. But something, maybe intuition, maybe the little ache that still lived in the corner of my heart, made me answer. "Is this Olivia?" a woman's voice asked, soft and brittle around the edges. "Yes," I said cautiously. "Who's calling?" "This is Linda Grant. I used to live 3 houses down from your parents. Your mother, well, she asked me to call you if things ever got bad." The world seemed to still for a moment. Bad how I asked, though I already felt the answer forming like a bruise. "Your mother's been sick for a long while. She didn't want word getting out your father. He didn't want people talking, but she always hoped you'd come home someday." I sat down heavily on the bench outside the building, my heart thudding against my ribs. How sick. There was a pause. "Hospice," she finally whispered. "It won't be long now." I felt something inside me unravel, not the clean break of anger, but the slow tearing of regret. I hadn't spoken to my mother in 2 decades. She'd tried in small hidden ways, Holiday cards slipped into envelopes, whispered phone calls made from grocery store payphones when those still existed, but she'd never stood against my father, not when it mattered most. Still, she was my mother, the woman who held my hair when I was sick as a child, the woman who taught me how to braid bread dough, how to sew a button, how to fold laundry warm from the dryer, the woman who tried to touch my hand as I walked out that cold night. "Where is she?" I asked. But the moment Linda said the name of the hospice center, I felt the truth settle into my bones like cold water. I would be too late. I told my husband that night. He didn't say, "You should go," or "You owe her this." He simply wrapped his arms around me and said, "Whatever decision you make, I'm with you." His steadiness grounded me even as old memories churned like a storm. 2 days later, I received the second call. This time I didn't recognize the voice at all. It was a man from the funeral home. My mother was gone. The funeral would be the following week. I stared at the wall for a long time after I hung up. 20 years of distance collapsed into something sharp and claustrophobic. Grief mixed with guilt, anger mixed with longing. I didn't know where any emotion ended or began. My husband approached quietly. "Are you going home?" he asked. I almost said no. Returning meant facing my father, the man who had thrown me out like garbage, the man who had erased me from the family like crossing out a line in a ledger, the man who had refused to let my mother speak my name aloud. "How can I whispered. He slid his hand into mine. "Because your mother deserves to be honored, and because you deserve closure, not for him, for you." That night I sat at the kitchen table long after everyone was asleep. My Navy uniform hung neatly over the back of a chair. Its crisp lines and polished insignia were the physical proof of the life I had built, without my father's approval. I reached into an old keepsake box and pulled out the Christmas card my mother had sent me years ago. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded from time. "I love you, Livy." Those 4 words had carried me through the hardest years of my life. And suddenly the decision became clear. I would go home. Not as the frightened girl he abandoned, not as the mistake he believed I was, but as the woman I had become. The day of the flight felt surreal. I wore my dress blues not for show, but because they represented truth. My truth. The truth my mother had quietly celebrated even when she couldn't say it aloud. My husband held my hand through the turbulence, through the quiet moments, through the breath I drew, as we stepped off the plane onto the soil of a town that no longer felt like mine. When we pulled into the church parking lot, I froze. Not from fear, but from the strange sense of stepping into a photograph, everything familiar yet faded. The white steeple, the peeling shutters, the small garden my mother used to tend every spring. She had loved daisies best. They were wilted now. Families gathered in small groups near the entrance. People glanced my way, some with surprise, others with confusion. I saw whispers ripple among them like wind through tall grass. "That's her, Olivia. I thought she left. Is that a uniform?" I walked inside anyway, shoulders squared, chin steady. My husband's hand brushed my back, reminding me I wasn't alone, not anymore. My mother lay in the casket at the front. I approached slowly, the air thick with lilies and sorrow. She looked peaceful, older, thinner, but unmistakably her. The ache that rose in my chest felt like it might split me open. I rested my fingertips lightly on the edge of the casket and whispered, "I'm here, Mom." Tears slipped down my cheeks, hot and silent. I didn't wipe them away. Then I felt eyes on me, heavy, familiar. I turned. My father stood across the room, arms crossed, expression unreadable but cold. 20 years had etched deep lines into his face, but the rigid pride was the same. He didn't move toward me. Not yet. He just watched as though assessing whether I deserved to stand beside my own mother's body. And I realized in that moment he still believed he had the right to judge me. But the reckoning between us had only just begun. I felt my father watching me long before he took a single step in my direction. His stare was like a weight pressing between my shoulder blades, heavy, expectant, almost impatient. It was the same stare he used to give me when I'd track mud into the house, the same stare that made me shrink as a child. But now, standing in my navy dress blues beside my mother's casket, I didn't shrink. I didn't fold inward. I simply breathed, let the grief settle into my bones, and reminded myself who I had become. Eventually he moved. His footsteps echoed along the worn church floor, slow, deliberate, carrying that same old air of authority. When he reached me, he stopped just close enough that I could smell the faint scent of aftershave, an old brand he'd used all my childhood. Memory hit me like cold wind. Olivia. His voice was clipped as if the 2 decades we'd spent apart were a minor inconvenience rather than a canyon he'd carved with his own hands. I turned to face him, Dad. He looked me up and down, not with wonder or pride, but with a kind of suspicious appraisal. His eyes lingered on my uniform, on the medals, the ribbons, the bars on my shoulder. For a brief second I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, maybe even admiration, but then his mouth tightened, erasing it. So, you came, he said, as though the simple act of showing up required his approval. I came for Mom, I replied evenly. He shifted, his weight jaw tightening. Your mother asked about you every day, you know. The words were sharp, almost accusatory, but you didn't come home. A familiar ache rose in my chest, that old mixture of guilt and anger. She could have called, I whispered. She was ashamed, he snapped. I stared at him. Ashamed of what, of me getting pregnant at 16, or of you throwing me out? His eyes hardened. You made your choices, Olivia. Choices have consequences. I did what any father would do, taught you a lesson. There it was. The same justification he'd clung to 20 years ago. Pride masquerading as righteousness. I felt my hands curl into fists at my sides, but I refused to let the anger take over. I had worked too long and too hard to let him drag me back into the girl I once was. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. So, did you finally learn it? I blinked. Learn what? That you were wrong, he said. That you ruined your life. That you proved me right. I let out a slow breath. In the hush of the funeral home, the weight of his words landed with dull heaviness. He genuinely believed my success, my service, my child, my life had happened because of what he did. As if abandoning me had somehow forged me into something worthy. You really think that, I asked quietly? He lifted his chin, confidence swelling. You turned out better because of what I did. One day you'll thank me. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so tragic. This man, this rigid, pride-filled man, was so desperate to protect his narrative that he couldn't see the truth standing inches from him. Before I could respond, I felt my husband approach. He gave me space, but his presence was a steadying force. My father's eyes flicked toward him, narrowing slightly, as if trying to determine whether this man was friend, stranger, or threat. And who is this? My father asked, tone dismissive. I straightened my shoulders. My voice was calm, measured. Yeah, then meet my husband. My father froze, not dramatically, not theatrically, but like a man suddenly robbed of breath. His gaze snapped to my husband's posture, the respectful nod, the quiet confidence radiating from him. My husband extended a hand. Sir, he said warmly, it's an honor to meet you. My father hesitated. When he finally took the handshake, he winced slightly at the strength of it. My husband wasn't flexing or showing dominance, just being himself, solid, grounded, a man built from kindness, not cruelty. My father cleared his throat. And what do you do? My husband answered simply, I'm a Navy veteran, served 12 years, now I work in emergency response. A flicker of surprise jolted across my father's face. He looked between us again, between my uniform, my husband's steady presence, and the life he had told himself I was incapable of building. He tried to recover. Well, I see you found someone who straightened you out. My husband's expression softened, but his voice held steel. Sir, your daughter didn't need straightening out. She needed support. And she's the strongest person I've ever known. The words landed like a blow. For the first time, my father's bravado cracked. His eyes darted around the room as if suddenly aware that other mourners were glancing our way, whispering softly. I heard one older woman murmur, Is that Olivia? She's Navy now. Another said, She looks just like her mother. My father's jaw clenched. He had spent 20 years controlling a narrative, my disappearance, my shame, my failure. But now here I stood in full uniform with a husband who respected me, and a life rooted in strength he had never imagined. He stepped back as if he needed space to process what he was seeing. "You look different," he muttered. "I am different," I replied, "because I had to become someone you refused to believe I could be." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence between us stretched heavy and unyielding. My husband reached for my hand. I took it. And for the first time in 20 years, my father had nothing to say. The reckoning wasn't finished, not by a long shot. But in that moment the balance shifted. Not because I humiliated him, not because I raised my voice, but because my life contradicted every judgment he had ever made about me. And he knew it. The reception after the funeral was held in the church's fellowship hall, a plain room with beige walls, metal folding chairs, and long tables draped with cream-colored tablecloths. It smelled faintly of coffee, deviled eggs, and the lilies people had brought for my mother. Conversations murmured like background static, low steady punctuated by the occasional soft laugh that felt out of place in a room filled with grief. I stayed near the entrance for a while, needing space, needing air. My husband squeezed my hand before letting go so I could breathe on my own. People trickled in, some recognizing me immediately, others staring with vague curiosity before their eyes widened in realization. A woman I vaguely remembered from childhood, gray hair now cropped short. Her sweater decorated with embroidered cardinals approached me timidly. "Olivia, is it really you?" I managed a small smile. "Hi, Mrs. Thompson." "Oh my goodness," she whispered, pressing a hand to her chest. "Your mother talked about you, you know. Not openly, but every chance she could." Her eyes glistened. She would have been so proud. I swallowed hard. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Others came, two old neighbors, former teachers, people who remembered the scandal but had softened with time. Most offered condolences mixed with hesitant admiration when they glanced at my uniform. Not one of them asked about the baby I'd had at 16. It was as if age had sanded the rough edges off their judgment. But through it all, I felt my father's presence like a storm cloud hovering at the far end of the room. He stood stiffly near the refreshment table, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching the way people engaged with me. Each time someone complimented my service, his posture stiffened further. Each time a neighbor said, "Your daughter turned out well," his face twitched just slightly. He hadn't expected this. Not the respect, not the murmured praise, not the way people looked at me with warmth instead of pity. I wasn't the town's whispered shame anymore. I was the daughter he had cast out, who'd built a life far stronger than the one he tried to control. And it was eating at him. As the room filled, my husband rejoined me. He stayed close, a steady presence without overshadowing me. "You doing okay?" he murmured. "I think so," I said quietly. "It's strange being here." "Strange how? It feels like walking into a memory I don't fit into anymore." He nodded. "Because you grew beyond it." Before I could answer, my father finally broke from his self-imposed corner. His steps were faster this time, impatient, unsteady, almost as if he feared someone else might get to me first before he could reassert his narrative. He came to a stop directly in front of us, shoulders squared, chest puffed slightly. "Olivia, I need to talk to you," he said sharply. My husband didn't move, but I felt him attune himself to the tension, ready if needed. I crossed my arms, gently mirroring my father's stance, but without the edge. "We are talking." His eyes flicked to my husband, alone. I shook my head. "If you have something to say, you can say it here." My father exhaled sharply through his nose. "Fine." He straightened. "You made quite the entrance today." All that he gestured vaguely at my uniform is impressive enough, I suppose. "Thank you," I said. "But don't think it changes anything," he added quickly. My husband's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. I raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't it?" My father launched into a speech he'd clearly rehearsed. "People are acting like you're some kind of hero. And your mother." His voice faltered briefly. "Well, she always believed in you too much. Coddled you. Let you make mistakes." I stared at him. Getting pregnant at 16 wasn't a mistake. It was hard. But it wasn't a moral failure. He scoffed. "You embarrassed this family. I was a scared kid, and instead of helping me, you threw me out." He crossed his arms again, "And look how you turned out." Yes, I said evenly. Look how I turned out. The silence that followed was thick, heavy. He wanted credit, wanted to believe that his cruelty had somehow shaped me into a success story, that his rejection had been righteous, even necessary. My husband stepped forward just enough to be at my side. Sir, he said, voice firm but respectful, your daughter is exceptional because she chose courage when others chose judgment. She built her life not despite what you did, but in defiance of it. My father's face flushed red. I did what I thought was right. No, I said softly. You did what you thought would protect your reputation, not me. People nearby had turned subtly toward us, not staring outright but listening. My father noticed. His breath quickened. I don't need a lecture from you or from him, he snapped, jerking his chin toward my husband. My husband didn't waver. I'm not lecturing you. I'm stating a fact. You see a lesson learned. What I see is a young woman who raised a child alone, served her country, earned respect through grit and integrity. And what would you know about her? My father barked. I know, my husband said calmly, that you missed out on knowing the best parts of her. My father opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His jaw moved, but no words formed. His eyes darted from me to my husband to the people quietly observing. For the first time, true confusion, maybe even fear, flickered across his face. He had lost control of the narrative. He had lost control of me. He stepped back unsteady as though realizing the room no longer rallied behind him. That the daughter he cast out had returned not broken, but whole, stronger than he had ever allowed himself to imagine. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't cry, I didn't need to. My life spoke for itself. And my father was forced to hear it. After the reception began to thin out, the evening light dimming through the stained glass windows, I slipped outside to breathe. The air was cool, still carrying the scent of lilies from earlier, and the parking lot was quiet except for the soft hum of distant traffic. I stood beside the little garden my mother used to tend, wilting daisies, tired soil, and let myself feel the full weight of the day. My mother was gone. My childhood was gone. But something else, something long frozen, was beginning to thaw. I heard the door open behind me. Slow footsteps approached. For a moment I hoped it was my husband, but the cadence was different, heavier, uneven. When I turned, my father stood a few feet away, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, face stiff. Olivia, he said quietly, can we talk? Part of me wanted to say no. Part of me wanted to walk away and leave him with the silence he'd given me for 20 years. But another part, older, steadier, softened by motherhood and Navy discipline, knew that walking away now would leave something unfinished inside me. Okay, I said. He looked surprised, as if he'd prepared himself for a fight I wasn't interested in having. For several moments neither of us spoke. He stared at the ground, shoulders rising and falling with unsteady breaths. Finally he said, I didn't expect you to come. I came for Mom, I replied gently, not for you. He nodded, absorbing the truth without flinching for once. She always hoped you'd come home. She kept a drawer of your pictures. His voice tightened. She never stopped loving you. My throat burned. I never stopped loving her either. He swallowed hard, his gaze shifting to the church door. She wanted to reach out, many times. But He trailed off. You wouldn't let her, I said, not accusing, just stating what we both knew. His silence was an admission. A light breeze rustled the dying flowers. My father's jaw tightened. I thought I was doing the right thing, he said slowly. Back then, you were 16, a child, and He broke off. I was angry, embarrassed. I didn't know how to handle it. So you handled it by throwing me out. He flinched, visibly, like the words had struck something raw. I told myself it was discipline, he whispered, that you'd learn, that someday you'd come back and thank me. His voice cracked. But I was wrong. I see that now. I watched him closely. He wasn't performing. He wasn't defending himself. He was unraveling piece by rigid piece the armor he'd carried since the day he slammed the door behind me. He glanced at my uniform. I heard people talking about your service, about the kind of sailor you became. His eyes lifted to mine. You did everything I said you couldn't do. No, I corrected softly. I did everything you said I wasn't worth. He looked down again. I know, and I'm sorry. The words hung in the air, simple, imperfect, 20 years too late, but real. I should have protected you, he whispered. I should have helped you. I should have stood by your mother instead of making her choose between us. I failed her, and I failed you. I felt something shift inside me, not forgiveness, not yet, but a loosening of the old knots tied tight around my heart. If you're apologizing just because people respect me now, I began. He shook his head sharply. No, I'm apologizing because losing your mother made me see exactly what I've lost. I can't get her back. But maybe... His voice trembled. Maybe I haven't lost everything. I let the silence stretch, giving myself time to breathe, to feel, to weigh my own heart honestly. I thought of Irene, of the kindness that saved me. I thought of my child, of the home I'd built, the life I'd carved out of stone and determination. I thought of my husband's steady voice telling my father he'd missed the best parts of me. And then I looked at the man in front of me, not the tyrant of my childhood, not the voice that screamed, "Get out," across a kitchen full of pot roast and fear, but a tired, aging man, worn down by regret. I can't pretend the past didn't happen, I said softly, and I can't let you back into my life overnight. He nodded, eyes glassy. I understand. But I continued, surprising even myself. I'm willing to try, slowly, carefully, for Mom and for me. His breath caught. Thank you, he whispered. I don't deserve it, but thank you. I stepped closer, not embracing him, but offering something gentler a chance. We'll start small, I said. A call. Maybe lunch next time. And it has to be honest. No pride. No rewriting the past. He nodded again, voice shaking. I can do that. We stood there for a while, two people who once shared a home but had spent 20 years living on opposite sides of silence. And in that quiet, something new took root. Not a repaired relationship yet, not forgiveness, but possibility. A beginning. When I returned inside, my husband slipped an arm around my waist. How did it go? I exhaled slowly, not perfect but honest. He smiled warmly. That's more than most people ever get. As we prepared to leave, I looked at my mother one last time. In my heart, I spoke the words I wished I'd said when she was alive. I made it, Mom. I'm okay, and I'm finally coming home, not to the house you lived in, but to the love you always hoped would find me. To the audience listening, especially the older ones who've lived through their own storms of pride and heartbreak, I'll say this. If there's something left unsaid between you and someone you love, say it while you still can. Pride has never healed a single wound. But humility, honesty, and forgiveness, those can rebuild whole families. Thank you for listening. And if this story touched you, share it with someone who might need it. And feel free to stay a while. There are more stories, more hearts, more healing ahead.